Hi, I'm Alex, and today I will be responding to Donovan's claim that the U.S. government spends an outrageous amount on its military defense budget. And my opponent's secondary claims are that, one, the U.S. budget grows as we police the world more. Our military is wasteful on how it spends its budget and puts its citizens and soldiers in danger. And thirdly, that the U.S. values its military over the education and infrastructure of its people. I'm going to prove to you that my opponent's claims do not hold as much validity as they might seem, and that the military budget is not outrageously wasteful. So my opponent's first claim again is that the U.S. budget grows as we police the world more. And I would like to say that extending military power beyond the country's lines can prove to be beneficial to international affairs. And it would not necessarily be a waste of money to do so. My opponent presented two studies by the Pew Foundation done in 2002 and 2010. They show that the U.S. global image had been slipping, and the studies saw a decrease in approval between those 2 years. Now, what I have to say about this is it's outdated information. That was 6 years ago, and for one thing, U.S. global opinions are fickle and seem to change over time, and that can even be seen in the 8 years between the studies, the decrease of global opinion. Who's to say that it hasn't increased? There's not enough information provided that's current on the issue. And having to do with world policing being seen in something other than a negative light, a fellow at the University of Chicago Institute of Politics claims that the U.S.-led global alliance has created a vast zone in which interstate conflict is largely unknown and commerce can flow freely. American leadership allows and encourages our allies to cooperate, and it makes it effectively impossible to wage war on each other. So what we can take from this is just that the amount of money that we're spending to extend our arms into other nations can possibly not be a waste and benefit us later by having us avoid conflicts. My opponent's second point is that our military is wasteful on how it spends its budget, and it puts its citizens and soldiers in danger. Now, while I do concede that the military budget has overspent in some areas, I disagree that the entire budget is wasteful. One thing that my opponent mentions is when we pulled out of Iraq in 2010 and how lots of military equipment was wastefully left in a facility and eventually taken over by ISIS. And this was not a good situation for us, but once again, this was 2010 and it's 6 years later, so it's a little bit irrelevant, and it doesn't have that current hold on things today when the claim is that we're currently spending too much on the military budget. And if you are looking at things that are happening today, if you take a look at the Congressional Budget Office website, it publishes articles on what's happening in current affairs and some of the things that are being talked about in the past. And some of the articles listed on the front page are replacing military personnel in support positions with civilian employees, something that would reduce the military budget, preserving the Navy's presence with a smaller fleet, approaches to scaling back the Defense Department's budgetary plans, and approaches to reducing federal spending on military health care. So in all of these instances, there's direct relevancies to Congress allocating budgets in a lesser manner, or I guess to say that we're either working towards reducing or reducing what we're spending on the military. I would also like to point out that under this claim, my opponent makes several references to unlawful behavior and harming of civilians and soldiers by our military. And while it is true, like these things may be really tragic and kind of resonate with us and not reflect well on our nation, these aren't monetary issues. These are emotional appeals that do not support the claim that spending is the issue here, and it is outrageous. The third claim that my opponent makes is that the U.S. values its military over the education and infrastructure of its people. So my response to this is that there's a lot of evidence and assumptions that would be needed to connect these two ideas and to show that the federal military is, or the federal budget is getting overextended on the military. So my opponent firstly uses statistics of the decline in USA's global educational rank and says that we've dropped from 5th to 17th in the world view. And he's using that to show that the USA values the military more than education. But this evidence does not indicate a strictly monetary problem, and most importantly, does not take into account the relative cost of things. We should not be making the assumption that the tools to defend our nation are the same monetary value as the tools to educate. They're two completely different things that you can't really compare hand in hand. In my own research, I found that according to the National Center for Education Statistics, state and local funding accounts for approximately 93% of education expenditures. Education funding is not even a federal problem. It's only responsible for a small, the federal government is only responsible for financing a small portion of our education, and most of it is done by state and local governments, making it slightly relevant to this issue and doesn't really prove that we don't value our education federally. The same idea applies to our infrastructure. My opponent quotes a study rating the USA's infrastructure as a D+. But why is this strictly a federal issue again? Our political system is federalist, which means that it's layered, and it gives a good amount of power to state and local governments and budgets to finance many of these issues. So to make the connection that the federal discretionary budget is not getting enough money spent on these things is comparing kind of apples to oranges where it's not directly connected. Overall, my opponent's argument seemed like a slightly biased attack on the military and its principles as a whole, rather than a careful examination of the defense budget. In conclusion, an internationally extended U.S. military could possibly benefit the nation. Recent congressional activity shows cutbacks are in progress, and our nation's internal problems do not point to military excess. This shows that the U.S. federal government is not spending an outrageous amount on its military. Thank you.
All right, well, the structural stuff is all fine. On the first point, I think you've got a good argument about what the assumption is behind military spending. And I think there ought to be a little bit more demonstration about what the advantages are of a lack of conflict between nations and regular trade as a consequence of those sorts of things. Because that's really, that your argument is that there are substantial benefits here, and then you kind of mention what they would be, but it's a very vague argument on that. And I just think some evidence on that particular point would sell it a little bit more effectively. Let's face it, we do spend a lot of money doing that, so then the question becomes, are we getting our money's worth? So if you could say, for instance, that the stability of the international economy, which is a result of projected U.S. military forces around the world and keeping the peace between a variety of nations, results in trillions of dollars of economic activity versus the relatively small amount that we spend, then I think that argument makes a lot of sense. And that's the kind of thing that I think you could use in that particular point. On the wasteful argument, you've got a legitimate challenge here about the example that the advocate presents being relatively old. And by the way, I'm not sure that that's a spending issue. That's a policy issue that somebody made. Leaving the weapons and abandoning them as opposed to bringing them back. That was the advocate's argument, right? In Iraq, that they left the weapons and ISIS got a hold of them and that sort of thing. It's not like we spent the money on the weapons, or we didn't spend the money on the weapons. We spent the money on the weapons. It's a policy decision not to bring them back. That's the problem. That's not a spending issue. That's somebody made a boneheaded choice as to what to do with the equipment. That's not how we're spending the money. So I think there's an argument to be made on that particular point. Your argument, though, is basically, well, that's so 6 years ago, which is a reasonable argument to make. That we need more contemporary examples, I think, would be helpful. I did like the idea that says, look, the budget's not out of control. Congress is always looking for ways to manage the budget, and then you had a whole series of examples to illustrate that. I thought that was a pretty reasonable answer. And then on the third point, I thought that your answers were spot on concerning why this isn't really a federal responsibility, that the standard that the advocate is using doesn't necessarily even tie into monetary issues. That's, us falling from 5th to 17th, the relationship to spending is not particularly explained. And then your argument that says, look, the vast majority of this are state and local issues, and they spend bucket loads on this. I think, for instance, maybe if you had some dollars and cents comparisons, I don't know how much all of the states spend combined on education issues, but I'm sure it's pretty substantial. That would have maybe expanded your argument a little bit more there, too. All right, thank you.